Move on to the next question. Just to my right, yes.
There was some conversation earlier about the importance of grassroots movements to create momentum for change. I'm wondering if you can expand on that idea of people-powered innovation or community-based innovation, and with particular reference, provide some examples of governments that are proactively enabling this process.
I'll talk a little bit about this whole era of crowdfunding got started because of, ironically, because of Pabst Brewing Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Pabst Brewing Company was for sale for $300 million, and these two gentlemen looked at that and says, "Oh, let's see if we can get a lot of people committed to raising the money to buy it." And so they had over 50,000 investors ready to put up money, and they had gotten up to a point of like $260 million committed to this. Excuse me. And it reached a point where suddenly the U.S. government took notice of this, and they said, "Wow, this is violating all kinds of security rules," and they shut it down as a result of it. But it was that incident, though, that caused the government to look at it and say, well, we really should have some form of crowdfunding that comes into play as a way of stimulating the economy, so that we don't have to just strictly rely on banks, rely on venture capitalists and angel networks and things like that. And so what this did is this created a new tool that enabled money to start flowing into the startup communities. And we're just on the verge of this experiment in the United States, so we don't have good track record of how this is going to evolve, but it's interesting because there's a whole lot of attention being paid to this right now.
Anyone, last quick comment?
Well, just on crowdfunding, we're just actually next week issuing a report on it, and we've been funding about a dozen different crowdfunding experiments. In a way, it's always been with us. Crowdfunding of churches and mosques and museums goes back throughout history, but the internet does make it possible to do it much faster and on a different scale. In the UK, it's about £70 million turnover at the moment, but on track to be about £1 billion within 3 years, we reckon. And our central bank reckons some crowdfunding models may well displace a lot of mainstream banking. Perhaps 3 or 4 other things which will answer your question on government support for people-powered innovation. We've experimented with a program funding communities where, with relatively small amounts of money, where they don't report to us in lengthy bureaucratic notes, but through blogs. And we don't even specify what they have to do so that they can actually change their goals. It's called Neighborhood Challenge, and it's worked quite well if you're interested. We've got another program with teenagers doing hackathons and so on, but essentially using gaming and apps writing as a tool for self-driven change and enterprise creation. Again, quite small sums of money for each individual project, quite a lot overall, and it sort of builds into the education experience change-making right from the start. There's a whole series of crowdsourcing platforms now out there, some at the city level, some at national government level, none really working in my view, but they will get to work. You know, they'll fix some of the design problems of the previous 2 or 3 generations. And I just heard yesterday Hong Kong has copied a thing we did in the UK, which was a £100 million fund, small grants for individual social entrepreneurs, again in a stage gate way to come up with ideas, but with very little bureaucracy. And Hong Kong's got a 500 million Hong Kong dollar fund to do this. So there's a lot happening around experimentation of using money in more creative ways to allow people to own the innovation process rather than, again, big government, big science, big business. But most of these, like crowdfunding, as Tom said, we don't really know where they'll go. But that makes it interesting.
I'd like to just make a comment that puts the spotlight on the other part of it. So this all sounds excellent to me, that there's great things the governments can do, great things the businesses can do. But I think there's another piece of this that needs attention. I started my career in a big company in Shell, and I remember for those of us who worked in Shell, we imagined that it was much more difficult than it really was to leave the big organization and to try to get something done as citizens or as entrepreneurs. And I think that that idea that the initiative or the activity has to be initiated or driven or supported by big organizations is not true and is counterproductive. And we have a much greater capacity to influence things than we imagine, and that really needs to be underlined if we're going to deal with the sort of challenges that we have in front of us.
Adam, thank you. We've got time for one quick question and a quick answer, so perhaps just from the side.
Just in terms of talking about the future, I wonder where in your workings you bring in the future not as change, but as that which doesn't change. That is to say, not the shock of the new, but the shock of what hasn't actually changed as being a future condition. Because it seems like you keep referring to the future as those things we look forward to without realizing how much comes along with us, which is also the future. So the question of how do you accommodate a description of the future which is an understanding or acknowledgement of what isn't going to change as opposed to what does change?
Which is a great twist on our conversation. Who'd like to take that?
It's a great question because there's, with all of the new technologies, with all the new communication systems that we've created, there's obviously lots of opportunity for things to change, but then you have to step back and look at, okay, what things actually stay the same though? So what items in all of this mix here becomes new variables that we have to deal with, and that kind of makes life interesting here because it's not always clear.
If you're looking at a generation or two out, you can be fairly confident death will be still with us, even despite Ray Kurzweil's best efforts. Taxes, God, faith, survives, thrives against many predictions of its demise. Probably the forms of democracy will still be not that different in a generation or two's time. And in some ways, what is striking, if you were a Martian and came to look at a city like Melbourne, how many of the things are essentially the same as 100 years ago. Most of the buildings, the transport system, there were cars 100 years ago, the electricity, the water, the energy systems, much of in some ways, and many people have pointed this out, there was much faster change in the second half of the 19th century than what we're living through now. And we generally overstate the speed of change, which is in fact relatively limited to some areas of life, particularly digital technologies, some lifestyle things. And we are in some ways incredibly lucky to live in times when lots of other things are very stable and pretty reliable.
So one of the things we looked at in one of my mastermind groups was this whole idea of forever jobs. Is there any position that's going to be around forever? And the only ones we could really come up with are fatherhood and motherhood. Everything else is a variable.
About futurist, you always need somebody to look in the future. Futurist is a good evergreen job.
But I think you really are wrong there. So compared to 40 years ago, let's just go through the list of occupations: lawyer, accountant, consultant, teacher, doctor, politician, minister of faith, journalist. There's a whole series of jobs which, in fact, have survived, and I would bet quite a lot of money will still be there in 50 years' time. And many people will have them as jobs for life as well.
But perhaps just in a very different form. Look, this has been, I hope, I've just found it absolutely fascinating, these various strands that we've covered today. We've had the thinkers and the philosophers, and then these incredibly practical examples that we've had from Jeff and Scott as well. So I'd like to thank you so much. I think I'm going to go back to the ABC, put my hand up to be the resident thinker. I think that is the job for me. And let's go forth, all of us, with power and love in perfect balance. So thank you so much. Please thank Adam Kahane, Jeff Mulgan, Scott Anthony, and Thomas Frey. Just a few practical things. The next masterclass starts at 2:30, so you have